All right, welcome back to Module 2 for Religion and Politics in a Global Context. This is RELG3292. We're in our second module. In the first module, we began to take on the task of what it means to approach religion academically, politics academically, and in many ways, I gave you the term of politicized religions. And so this is what we're going to begin to do now in 2, 3, 4, and 5. We're going to look at particular politicized religions. And it may not be exactly politicized religions, it may be more of a politicized religious tradition. And so, for instance, this week we're going to look at Sunni Islam. Next week we're going to look at Shia and Sunni Islam. And so, yeah, we're looking at Islam, but also we're looking at different traditions within Islam itself. So, I didn't give you a big picture in the first intro for Module 1. Let me do that now. So the first week we just dealt with politicized religion and some glossary terms, the difference between propaganda and truth or the academic study. This week we are going to deal with the whole topic of Sunni Islam. And in particular, we're going to look at Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. Now there's a reason why we're doing that. All right, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. But we're going to look at the major Islamic tradition, which is called Sunni. My guess is a lot of times you've been watching the news and the newscasters, the commentator will throw out the terms Sunni, Shia, Sufi, all kinds of different terms in Islam. When you finish this class, you're going to know exactly what these terms mean, and you can hopefully watch the news with great intelligibility. All right, so this week, Sunni Islam, and in particular, we're going to look at Sunni Islam in the expression of Sunni Islam in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. Next week, Module 3, we are going to deal with Shia Islam. All right, so the Sunnis comprise about 80 to 85% of the Muslims, so it's the largest tradition. So again, about 1.4 billion Muslims today, and about 80 to 85% of those would consider themselves as Sunni. The Shia was a splinter. In fact, the word Shia, it's an Arabic word that means a faction. The Shia will splinter off not long after Muhammad's death, and they will comprise about 10 to 15% of Islam. The Sunnis and the Shias really disagree with one another. In some ways, this is not quite a fair analogy, but maybe this will help you. And you'll hear me talk about this later on. But some academic scholars of religion will talk about the idea that Sunni, at least when you compare that to Christianity, the Sunnis would be Protestants and the Shias would be Roman Catholic. So I want you to see that Sunnis and Shia, they both go back to Muhammad. They both consider themselves as Muslims, but each group considers itself as the proper interpretation. Now, that's the word for this semester. Once again, we come back to what does it mean to interpret, and we've already talked about that. So then, in Module 3, we're dealing with Shia Islam, and we're going to look at Iraq and Iran. Most Shias live in Iran or Pakistan. And so it's very important for us to understand that, say for instance, when we hear something about Iran, we need to know that they're not Arabs. They're Persian. They don't speak Arabic. They speak Farsi. They're not Sunnis. They're Shia. And that's what we're going to deal with in Module 3 and what it means to see radicalized Shiism in Islam. In Module 4, we're going to turn our attention to Israel and America and the whole Palestinian situation. If you remember in Module 1, I talked about Osama bin Laden and his claim that he made that the reason why he executed 9/11 was because of the way that Israel treats the Palestinians, and most Muslims see us as Americans basically supporting Israel in their treatment of the Palestinians. So week 4, we're going to look at Zionism. We're going to look at, if you will, radical interpretation within Judaism and more modern interpretation. Then in week 5, and this shocks some people, and in fact, just a few weeks ago, our president, Mr. Obama, gave an address to the prayer breakfast. And it eventually became an uproar because he said something like, you know, we need to remember, yes, there are Muslims who are violent, but we need to also remember that Christianity has a violent tradition. And I think that's very important for us. Again, go back to some of the things we've talked about as we study certain elements in our world. What does it mean to try to approach our biases and our prejudices? And we need to really remember that Christianity has had violence in the past. Go all the way back to the Crusades. Go all the way back to the ghettos that many Christians placed Jews in, especially in Europe and in Eastern Europe. But also understand that there are radical Christians, there are militant Christians today, and so we'll look at the KKK, and we'll look at some other traditions within Christianity that I would term as being fundamentalist, as being literalist, as being extreme, as being very violent and against the understanding of religion, of Christianity. So let's come back to Module 2. Just a few thoughts, and then let's get into it. We're going to look at Sunni Islam, which I said previously was basically about 85% of the Muslims. So the majority of Muslims are Sunni. They take themselves all the way back to Muhammad, but they believe that essentially their branch of Islam, which they think is the true branch of Islam, they don't choose someone who is a descendant of Muhammad. All right, this is after Muhammad's death. Sunnis, the word Sunnah means tradition or custom. It's not important who the descendant was for Muhammad. What's more important is the leaders in their expression of Islam will basically be people who are qualified. They will be people that the community agrees. They can be a leader. They can be a cleric, not because that one is related to Muhammad or his descendants, but because he has that upstanding tradition within his culture. So the Sunnis have predominantly been in what is North Africa now and also the Middle East. But I think it's also important for us to understand that militant Islam is actually a new endeavor. All right, all of this extremist Islam is only about 200 years old. If you go back to our class on Encountering the World's Religions, I talked about the idea that the study of religion is actually only about 200 or 300 years old. Well, so is militant, fundamentalist, extremist Islam. And many people take the extreme version of Islam back to Saudi Arabia. And we're going to learn a term this week. It's called Wahhabism. And Wahhabism, about 150, 200 years old, actually named after a gentleman by the name of Wahhabi. He proposed a very extreme, non-contextualized, non-historical, literal interpretation of Islam. And this was oppressed by those who were in Saudi Arabia at the time, but eventually it became a worldwide movement. Eventually this will become an influence for Al-Qaeda, for Osama bin Laden, ISIL, so forth and so on. Wahhabism that developed in Saudi Arabia will be an extreme literalist interpretation of Islam, and that's going to be, if you will, the philosophy of many of the violent jihadis. All right? This, in many ways, has been forced underground by many of the Muslim community and also even the powers in Saudi Arabia. And so we're going to go back to Saudi Arabia to try to understand where extremist religion came from. Then we're going to look at Turkey. Of course, we'll deal with Egypt, but I'll come back to that this week in this module. But we're going to come back to Turkey, and we'll really end this week with Turkey because there's a teaching out there, there's a belief out there that democracy will never work in a predominantly Muslim country. Turkey argues against that. Does Turkey have problems? Of course. Are there radicals in Turkey? Absolutely. But Turkey is a modern experiment that basically is trying to remain Muslim, dominated by Muslim thought, and yet remain also democratic. And so this week, we're going to use lots of different media to look at Saudi Arabia, at Egypt, and at Turkey. And if you have any questions, send those to me on email.